Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our July 31st edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today's episode features a midsummer analysis of market conditions and insight from an agronomist on where things stand with crops across Iowa. Then, at the end, we'll share a handful of reasons you'll want to stop by Farm Bureau Park at the upcoming Iowa State Fair, and we'll bring your attention to a couple of upcoming educational opportunities for farmers and rural entrepreneurs. It's a big episode, so we'll get right to it. First up is Karl Setzer, who's the brokerage research lead for Midco Commodities, which was formerly AgriVisor. Karl called up spokesman reporter Corey Munson last week to talk about recent developments in Ukraine, the current crop in South America, grain stocks in the U.S., and some other market drivers that farmers should have their eyes on in the coming weeks and months.
We wanted to touch base with you to get some sense of what's influencing the crop markets right now as we're heading into the fall harvest season. Can you kind of run us through some of the major drivers of prices, especially in corn and soybeans?
Yeah, some of the big ones we're having right now, Corey. Obviously, at the top of the list is the developments in Ukraine. You know, that's more of a factor for the grain side, for the corn market. But the loss of some oil seed coming out of Ukraine, an issue there, more so for the sunseed oils. Ukraine contributes 25% of the world's supply of sunflower oil, for example. So definitely a factor there we're watching. And of course, the weather across not just the United States, but the global weather outlooks. There's some trouble spots around the world, but there's some very good spots as well. Another big factor that we have right now, Corey, and this is an underlying one that we are watching more than anything, is the managed money crowd. And with the Dow currently trading the highest it has in the past 6 months and seeing 11 days of straight gains here, definitely bringing some investors back to the marketplace, and that has been a great benefit as well. And of course, we have many underlying smaller factors that have contributed to the market rally here we've seen as well.
Now, you mentioned Ukraine and the Black Sea. So specifically, I guess the newest development is that there was this deal in place that allowed Ukraine to export some of its goods to market via Black Sea ports. And Russia recently pulled out of that deal and then started shooting missiles at those ports. So do you have any sense for kind of what the condition of the ports are, and if it's even possible for Ukraine, if the deal was to be restored, to get back into the export game?
Yeah, looking at them, and you are correct. When the corridor that was open expired, now really the corridor, so to speak, is just what it was is a program or an allowance that Russia said, look, if ships are coming into Ukraine to load grain out, we're not going to attack them. They will not see military action. The agreement ended, and that is why Russia started attacking the ports. They are no longer giving a, quote, free pass to grain vessels that want to come into the Black Sea. So in effect, they shut off Ukraine from the Black Sea itself. Now, Ukraine had said, okay, we'll start coming out of the Danube River. They do have some land routes they can take, and quite a bit of their grain expected to flow through Romania. It's a little bit more costly to ship grain out there, and it takes a little bit longer. But one of the big things is the volumes decline. And yes, that is an issue, not just for the exporters, but there's several countries that have grain that they have purchased, and they're waiting for it to be loading, and now they can't get it, and they have to scramble someplace else to try to find what they need. So it's kind of a powder keg over there. One thing that is a bit of a game changer, and just in the past few days here, China has entered the mix and signed a trade agreement with Ukraine. And that really caught some of us in trade a little bit surprised, because now we have to sit and say, okay, Will Russia really attack ships coming in, and are they willing to stand up to China? So that's a question we're going to watch there. The big thing is we have to look at, and Ukraine is a major supplier of grain to the world. People don't realize that 15% of the world's corn supply has came out of Ukraine. That's expected to drop to 10% this year because of the logistics issues. Now, it'll still be there, but the volumes will be down, a little bit more concerned. So definitely a game changer there. The question is, Corey, is not just terminals have been hit, but storage facilities, some rail lines. So we have a lot of information to go through and a lot to look at to see if this is going to be an ongoing figure and a problem that we're going to have to overcome. My opinion, it's going to take a few months just to find out what the damage is, and likely years to get everything back to where it needs to be.
While we're talking about Ukraine losing access to certain markets and limiting what they can send out, it seems like Brazil continues to up the ante on their production levels of both corn and beans. So kind of where is South America headed as far as a global grain supplier and a competitor to the U.S.?
That's a big one. And, the old adage used to be buy land in the United States because they're not making it anymore. Well, we are making more land. It's just coming out of Brazil right now. And, we did have the drought in Argentina, obviously, the La Nina this year that devastated their production. Did not impact Brazil as much as earlier thought. So Brazil is going to put out some huge crops this year. 162 million metric tons of soybeans is what we're looking at. Corn production up around 130 million metric tons. Those are about 10 to 15 million metric tons higher than what we were expecting when the La Nina drought was taking place. Now, looking forward to next year, Brazil is saying, okay, we're going to up our production even more, probably around 165 million metric tons of soybeans. So, about 5 million more. And their corn production expected to increase to about 135 million metric tons. The thing is, this is not going to be a one-year thing. Data just came out of Brazil this morning saying that by the year 2032, so 10 years down the road, they want to increase their total production by 24%. That would be 75.5 million metric tons more grain than they produce this year. Now, that's cotton, soybeans, corn, wheat, that's everything. But of that volume, 75% alone is expected to be soybeans. That is really tempering concerns over the loss in U.S. production for the simple fact that Brazil is going to be there with this bigger crop and they want to keep increasing on it. But not just Brazil, Argentina expected to have better weather forecasts coming up. We've switched to an El Nino. Total South American production expected to be over 20 million metric tons higher than this year on corn and 30 million metric tons higher than this year on soybeans. That will go a long ways in satisfying global demand. It's not what we want to hear, Corey, but this is going to turn the United States into a backstop for South America. We have switched roles here and really looking at it. We used to produce crops in the United States that were big enough to support global demand for a year. Now we only have to really provide enough to cover the market for 3 to 4 months.
Well, and another issue I know when trying to compete with South America is our commodities are just more expensive than theirs are. Is that still accurate? And kind of what's the driver behind those price differences?
It's a huge factor right now, Corey. And yes, U.S. corn at this time nearly 80 cents a bushel above South American corn. Soybeans about 60 to 70 cents above the South American offers. A lot of it is our cost of production in the United States is higher than South America's. So, we can't offer our corn as cheap as they do. They're also in the middle of harvest down there. So you do see harvest lows, harvest pressure. That's making their grain a little bit cheaper. But the thing is these price differences are being longer and longer and longer in the marketing years, so it's cutting into our demand further and further. One of the big ones, though, the U.S. dollar. And if we look at the U.S. dollar index trading around 102 points, we had dipped below 100. We've rallied back. There's some economists thinking that U.S. dollar could approach 106 to 108 on the index. The simple fact that our commodities cost more with the dollar because they have to be bought in U.S. dollars, that's what we trade in, that raises the price. And then, Corey, these interest rate hikes that we've seen from the Federal Reserve, if a country needs to borrow money to buy their inputs, it just snowballs and it just really pushes us out of the market. And that's why we do have rallies in the market to support corn and soybeans. But we don't have anything long standing because we just simply price ourselves out, our demand drops and the market drops, and then we see this volatility increase. This is not going anywhere anytime soon, Corey.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the U.S. supply. As I understand it, we've been actually in several years of really tight stock-to-use levels and just not having a lot of grain in storage available to us outside of the harvest season. What is our current condition? What's USDA saying about our stored corn and bean levels, and kind of what are we looking at coming out of the 2023 harvest?
When the monthly WASDE numbers come out and I report them and break them down, I really focus on one aspect of the report immediately, and I'll go back a little bit, but Corey, stocks to use is what I look at. The rest of the numbers are really ever changing. We do have changes to yield, we have changes to production, we have changes to acres, changes to demand, and these all, you can't pick apart and say, okay, corn yield, it's down 2 bushels per acre, so it should be bullish for the market. That's not necessarily true. And we're looking at now, at the end of this marketing year, the 2022-23 marketing year on corn, a stocks-to-use ratio of 10.2%, and that's with a 1.4 billion bushel carryout. Next year, that is expected to increase to 2.26 billion bushels with a stocks-to-use at 15.6%. Even if we drop yield, Corey, and that's with corn yield at 177.5, if we take that corn yield all the way down to 170 bushels per acre, 3 bushels per acre less than last year, our stocks to use is still 200 million bushels higher than it was this year at 1.6 billion bushels, or about 12%. Corn is going to struggle. We have a huge crop coming at us and our demand is faltering. Those numbers will keep being changed, but the stocks to use is what tells the story. And that's why the average cash value of corn is expected to decline $1.80 from this year to next. Looking at the soybeans, a different scenario starting to surface there. Our stocks to use at the end of this marketing year, 255 million bushels, or 5.9%. At the end of next year, that's only expected to increase to 300 million bushels, or 7% on the stocks to use, and that's with a 52 bushel per acre national average yield. I think that might be a little optimistic right now. I can't change that yield, but the bottom line is we are still in a rationing position on soybeans, and the market cannot afford to see really much more demand than we already have, and we can't afford to see much of a yield loss.
So I guess really the question is, and this is kind of what I think guys have been listening to the whole interview for, what are your recommendations for marketing the 2023 harvest? Are you suggesting we hold some for a little while? You want to sell them off the back of the combine?
To break it down quick, look at what you have insurance on and what your insured levels are. Anything that your uninsured bushels, your excess inventory, I would definitely look at moving that off the combine this fall. We've had some pretty good basis values. Our futures are holding pretty good. Yeah, they're a little bit depressed from where we were, but we're still talking 560 to 575 corn, and I'm talking December futures, November soybeans on the plus side of $14. Storage is going to be expensive this year. So to maybe market instead of paying that storage, you got to look at it and say, you know what? There's not enough carry in this market to really warrant paying commercial storage. things you can put away on the farm, I think you have a little more price potential on, especially when I look at that soy complex with that tight stocks to use. The thing is, I would look at this year probably more than any, Corey, the use of a minimum price type contract. Even if you have to move stuff off the combine, setting a minimum price is probably a pretty good way to go. But I would definitely think that we're going to see, I think we have price potential to work higher. If we look at some of the summer corn futures up around that 575 to 580, definitely where you want to start layering in some, because like I said, we have huge South American crops coming at us, and those are going to cap our gains if we do not see big losses to production this year.
Well, thank you so much for the insight, Karl. Karl was just recently featured on one of our educational webinars, so that is available on iowafarmbureau.com. Just search for July 2023 WASDE and June 1 grain stocks review and insight webinar, and you can find some more of what Karl has to say about the markets. Thank you again for taking the time, Karl. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Corey.
There's a lot to digest, and we appreciate Karl offering his thoughts on the current global dynamics and then sharing some tactical tips for farmers there at the end. At the end of that interview, Corey mentioned a webinar that Karl did for us recently on the July WASDE report and the most recent quarterly stocks report. If you'd like to dig into even more analysis of those reports, we've included a link to that webinar recording down in the notes for this podcast episode. Next, let's talk about the crop in the field with Andrew Penney, who's a technical agronomist with Bayer Crop Science. Spokesman editor Tom Block met up with Andrew during a field day in Atlantic last week, and Tom takes it from here.
Andrew, thanks for joining me today. It seems like the top things on growers' mind this summer is always drought. People that got rain, people that didn't. What are you hearing out there from farmers in different parts of the state, areas that you cover?
Yeah, definitely. It seems like the last 3 years, we are seeing those extreme weather events, whether it's drought or rainfall. This year specifically, drought's been top of mind. You go back a month and a half ago, we were extremely dry. And I would say there was a lot of pessimism. The recent rains we've got the last month and a half, I think that's totally changed the growers' outlook. I think from not just my territory, but across the Corn Belt, I feel like everybody's pretty optimistic. Granted, there's some pretty spotty rains in places. And so, you could be a grower with a field that gets a quarter or half an inch of rain, half a mile away, you don't get anything. So even though I feel like overall, the last month and a half, we have got some of those timely rains, that there's still some areas that are pretty dry and need rain, especially as you go further east and south. But overall, I think the majority of the Corn Belt's got some timely rains, and I think overall, everybody's pretty optimistic.
And as you talk to farmers, they're pretty good right now. These, like you said, these recent rains help, but they need maybe one more rain as we get in here into August, or one or two more rains for corn. And then especially for soybeans, they always say August rains make soybeans.
Pollination for corn, and then that flowering period for soybeans. Well said. Soybeans need that late August rains to make yield and add some kernel weight, seed weight. But corn specifically, we're just kind of finishing up that pollination window, and there's a pretty high uptake in water, and the water requirements for corn specifically, it's pretty high. You're looking at maybe a third of an inch, 3/10 of an inch a day, during pollination. So the amount of moisture combined with temperature is very important for corn. And so even though we've been getting those timely rains, I feel like most of the Corn Belt and I would say most of Iowa, there's still a lot of parts that we're going to need 2 or 3 more rains to get us through that grain fill period. And so anytime we have that conversation, pollination is obviously the most important and the most critical period for rainfall and ideal temperatures. But there's a week or 2 week window after that we can impact the number of kernels that we can harvest. But moving forward, and thinking about 2 to 3 weeks, a month from now, as we continue grain fill period, rain and Mother Nature can really dictate that grain fill period and our overall kernel weight. And at the end of the day, yield is all about number of kernels and then kernel weight. And so, it's just like soybeans, corn can be impacted by those later rains a little bit differently in terms of seed number, but overall, seed weight, that can definitely be impacted.
And we talked a little earlier, these last few years, like you said, have been on the dry side, but when we get to harvest, yields have been better than expected seems to be a general theme, and maybe that speaks to the genetics that we have today.
Yeah, absolutely. My father often refers to, what was it, I think the drought of 88, if I remember correctly. And I often hear, especially the last 2 to 3 years, man, if we would have had some of the hybrids and products we had back then, you'd be lucky to get 75 bushel. And so, I think that's just a tribute to our breeders. And so, obviously genetics plays a huge role, but it's still fascinating to me how we can continuously see the increase in our rate of genetic gain, and we see that straight line increase year over year here recently. And I think it's just a testament to our breeding program and our breeders that we can have hybrids and varieties that can tolerate these stresses and yet still maintain yield and actually increase yield year over year. So it is fascinating.
Yeah, it's a very interesting time to be part of agriculture.
Absolutely.
Looking at the current growing season, are there any prevalent pests and diseases affecting crops, and what measures farmers can take to manage them at this point?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of, it seems like with our continuous monocrop system or rotation, going from corn to soy, it seems like Mother Nature always finds a way to throw a wrench in our system. And, recently, as far as disease, tar spot's been a big issue. And I would say we're pretty lucky in the fact that, we've had diseases pop up for both corn and soy that maybe aren't fungal and dealing with maybe a bacterial pathogen. And so when those pop up, there's not really anything we can do other than genetic resistance. Well, we're lucky with tar spot. It's a big issue and it's a big problem, but we're lucky that fungicides still control that. And so, we're at that silking stage right now, and there was a lot of fungicides that went out at that tassel to, still getting put on today just to try and manage that pathogen. And so I would say that's probably the biggest, just because it's somewhat new, showed up here in Iowa in 2018. So I would say that's probably the major conversation going on. As far as pests, obviously we've had the conversation with the dry conditions, corn rootworms rearing its ugly head. I always expect that in dry scenarios. It always makes that feeding a little bit worse. We always visually see more symptomology with corn rootworm feeding. But I think with that too, other stuff that seems like it's becoming more common is stink bugs. It's not a new pest, but it seems like over the last few years, stink bug, just the populations have increased. And I would say probably the last 5, 6, 7 years, stink bug population just seem like they've been going up. And with that, there's just certain parts of the state that the Japanese beetle is an issue and continues to be an issue. And so it's kind of like corn rootworm, spotty. There are areas where it's just not an issue and some where it's a little bit more prevalent. But yeah, I would say corn rootworm, Japanese beetle, and stink bugs are probably some pests that we're dealing with. For soybean, I would say the newest one's probably still the soybean gall midge. Mm-hmm. If I remember correctly, I think we first identified that in 2018 or 2019 in northwest Iowa. You think of a little fly, how little you think it would move, but it's kind of gone from an area in northwest Iowa to now we're finding it down south of Karl. And so, similar to maybe some of these diseases, how they move, I'm wondering if maybe these weather patterns that we've had here recently, just the number of storms, the wind, the hurricanes, that can always impact insects and disease moving. So I'm wondering if maybe there's just some impact on what Mother Nature has been giving us as far as wind and storms that are maybe helping move these pests and diseases around a little bit quicker than what we would expect. But yeah, so like I said, soybean gall midge, first identified in northwest Iowa here in the state, and is moving a little bit quicker south than what I would have initially thought, being a small pest.
And that's one that's hard to treat because it burrows into the stem, and it's, I think, only outside as an adult for a very limited time. So what are the treatments or the scouting for gall midge?
Yeah, so that is a tricky one. I just sat in on a thesis presentation on just some new tactics. It's such a new pest that they're trying to figure out what they can do. And there was numerous different management tactics from, spraying, if I remember right, it was like a clay mixture onto the soybean plant at a certain time to prevent that burrowing at about the V2, V3 stage. And just not much success with anything. And so, right now, obviously, we're lucky that it just impacts the border rows for the most part. So, but I mean, even spraying an insecticide, just it's all about timing and identifying that. But at this point, it's really not too impactful of a pest because, soybeans, unlike corn, you can lose a great number of plants and still not let it impact yield just because it's the soybean's plasticity. And so, I think that's still something that we really don't have good answers, but I know universities like Iowa State are working on research to try and, if this pest does continue to get worse, that we have management practices that can help mitigate any yield loss.
And you mentioned tar spot. I want to talk about that a little bit more too. That's one of those diseases coming from the east, maybe to the west. And it seems to be coming in earlier. I remember 2 or 3 years ago when we first saw tar spot cross the Mississippi. That was a big move from Illinois or Wisconsin over into Iowa. But it didn't happen until later in the year, September, October. And now we're seeing it in July. So just talk about the evolution of that and maybe be more of a yield concern for farmers the earlier you see it.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like most of our diseases we're lucky enough to get from Nebraska, so it kind of moves from west to east. This was one that, like you said, has kind of moved from the eastern part to west. When we first identified it, was coming in really late. Obviously you think about the spores and the inoculum moving in, that could impact when that disease shows up. Now that we've identified that disease can overwinter here in the state and across the Corn Belt where it is colder, we know that inoculum overwinters in the residue. And so that's going to impact, obviously Mother Nature and the environmental conditions dictate when those spores germinate and the ideal conditions for that pathogen to infect. But, it seems like it is coming in if conditions are conducive, if we have the leaf moisture, if we have just overall high humidity so that we have the dew longer, overnight into the mornings, that's impacting how and when that pathogen infects. And so, now that we know that we have the inoculum, we are starting to see it a little bit earlier. And that just increases the threat for yield robbing scenarios. And so, going in, previously talking about fungicides, we could go in and have that conversation that, yeah, we know it's going to come in later. So maybe think about timing your fungicide application so that residual holds on a little bit longer. But it's one of those cases where it's tricky because, we have all these other diseases like northern corn leaf blight, gray leaf spot, southern and common rust that we have to manage that might come in earlier than what we typically see tar spot, even now. And so it's just tricky. It's tricky to make a broad recommendation to a grower because there's so many factors and so many other diseases. Even though tar spot's top of mind, we still got to think about all the other stuff that might have different environmental conditions that are favorable for that pathogen to infect. So it's a really tricky conversation, but we do know, and we are starting to see it come in earlier just because now that inoculum is here. And if we have good conditions for that pathogen to germinate and infect, we do start seeing it a little bit earlier. But yeah, overall, I would say that there's a lot to it. Stress, I've noticed that stress is really involved. The more the plant stress, the higher the incidence and severity. So there's just a lot to it.
This is the time of year, the last couple of weeks, we've seen a lot of airplanes, helicopters flying some fungicide on. But still important for growers to be out there scouting as much for treatments this year as well as to plan for next year. Talk about the importance of scouting.
I think that's becoming a more important conversation here the last few years. Whether we're talking corn rootworm management, we kind of went into that, the importance of scouting when the silks are out to look at adult beetle populations. But now you start factoring in diseases like tar spot. The importance of understanding what's going on in your field so that you can make a fungicide application or even an insecticide application that is actually going to be effective against the pests that you're trying to control is that much more important, I feel like, nowadays. And so, just understanding the timing and residuals and all the stuff that goes into making a product effective, if we're going to make some sort of application, is that much more important. And so it's not necessarily throwing a wrench in our system because we can still manage these pests, but it's making us be more proactive and actually having to work at controlling these. So it's changed the game in a good way, I think, because as we try and evolve with our science and the information we have and give to growers, we also, again, that work comes with that. But with that, we have all these scenarios that can impact and rob yield from growers and from our farms, but we can manage it. So at the end of the day, it's, luckily you do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. But it's made agronomists and growers, I feel like across the Corn Belt, just be more proactive about when they're out in their field scouting to understand what's going on currently, but also to make decisions for the next year. And so, it's just really changed how we plan for hybrids, timings of, you got in-furrow fungicides, in-furrow insecticides. There's just so much more now that, again, we're making those decisions based on those scoutings for not only the current growing season, but also the next growing season.
Let's pivot a little bit to weed management. What are the main weed pressures in fields this year and the strategies that are helping farmers manage those tough to control, maybe the resistant weeds?
Yeah, water hemp, giant ragweed, that still dominates the conversation. You'll get a little bit, mare's tail, and just depending on your geography. But I feel like you go anywhere in the Corn Belt, and water hemp is just that dominant conversation. And, kind of tying in the environmental conditions Mother Nature has given us the last few years. Anytime you factor in hot, dry conditions and droughty conditions, that's going to impact how our residuals work, right? And so, we know that we need soil moisture for those products to go into solution and activate and be impactful on those weed seeds that germinate. And so I feel like, again, going back to that moisture conversation, there's been areas that have got timely rains, and even going back to the planting season, and there are spots that have just been really dry up until about a month and a half ago. And so it definitely varies, and even within the field, right? We have different soil textures within the field that have different water holding capacities. So that's going to impact how residuals work. So, on top of the whole resistance conversation, especially when you start talking foliar applications, there's an additional conversation that has been had the last few years with the dry conditions that have impacted residuals in their efficacy.
You mentioned the variability field to field, but also, as you said, within the field. And that's maybe where growers can take advantage of some technology.
Yep. We don't just scout for diseases and insects, right? We got to be scouting for weed species and weed issues within our field. So, again, going back to current year management practices that we can potentially impact depending on the timing. It's also, again, thinking about active ingredients and solutions for the next growing season. And so it's always like we're continuously learning from our failures.
Yep.
And trying to improve on that. That's kind of one of the things that's always fascinating and I've loved about agriculture. You're always thinking and trying to have to, in a way, outsmart Mother Nature. And that's one of the tricky things with weed management. We have different active ingredients, different chemicals that have a little bit less water requirements than others. But what do you do with that situation specifically? Do you plan for specific products that might be a little bit more drought prone and work with a little bit less water activation? Or do you use products that are a little bit more water soluble and work better when you get plenty of rain? So there's really no good answer. It's kind of hard. I think at the end of the day, still we would just want to overlap residuals, focus on residuals, prevent weeds from emerging, and that's going to reduce our chance for resistance long term. But it's still tricky. Again, throwing into Mother Nature and she impacts that, it makes it that much trickier.
So as we wrap up here, what advice would you give to farmers as they're looking towards harvest, making informed decisions, as you mentioned, both for the rest of this year, things that could affect yield this year, as well as they start making plans for the 2024 growing season?
Yeah, I think probably one of the most important conversations I have with growers is, you and I kind of touched on, you go back 10 years ago, 200 and 210 bushel was, now I feel like with our yield potential and kind of going back to just genetics and breeding, we see so much higher yield potential nowadays. I think one of the most important things growers can do is just be adaptive. To get 275 bushel, we can't farm the same way we did when we were getting 200 bushel. So I think there's just so much more that needs to be put in and thought about when we're trying to reach those 250, 275 bushel farm averages. There are things when it comes to nutrient management, weed management, disease management that might change a little or change a lot when we're trying to attain those high yields.
And we heard a grower talk today, scouting from the sprayer, but the combine can also be a great place to scout from, right?
Oh, absolutely. And again, going back to insect management, weed management, or disease management, some of the best things you notice as a grower going through all those acres, whether you're spraying a post or going through the combine, you kind of get a good feel for what works, knowing the products that you use in your head, where your problem issues are within a field, where your problem diseases are, what your problem insects and weed species are. So that's all stuff that, whether it's writing down a note or just taking a mental note, again, what those are and how can we make this better for next year.
There's always something to be watching out for, and I wouldn't be surprised if a few of you are out scouting right now as you're listening into this episode. And before we know it, most of you will be out there scouting from the seat of a combine. It's hard to believe that's just around the corner. But before you start thinking too much about harvest, we want you to squeeze a little more fun out of this summer. The Iowa State Fair is August 10th through the 20th, and as usual, Iowa Farm Bureau has a number of reasons for folks to come see us there. For more on that, here's Iowa Farm Bureau's Zach Bader and Evelyn George.
So Evelyn, we're just a few short days away now from the 2023 Iowa State Fair. There's always plenty to do, plenty of chances to win at Farm Bureau Park at the Iowa State Fair. Let's start on what people can do when they come to the park, who they're going to meet. Let's start on that side of things.
You bet. We've been planning for months in anticipation of the Iowa State Fair. So we have farming members from across the state that have volunteered to work in the park because they love that chance to meet the public and for fairgoers to meet real farm families. So one way they can do that, everyone is invited to play the Farm Strong Challenge. So this is a tabletop game where there are questions and answers. And this year we're really focusing on generations of conservation, because for generations our farmers have taken on the challenge of improving Iowa's water quality, and now we're celebrating because they lead the nation in 7 different conservation practices. Once you play the Farm Strong Challenge game, you have a chance to win a fun prize, and you'll see messages and information about conservation throughout the park, through our banners and through some videos that we'll be showing, as well as in those questions. We have some great partners that have agreed to come into the Farm Bureau Park, and in fact, the first 9 days this year, we will have hands-only CPR training, which we're excited about because it's really important for bystanders to become first responders, especially in rural areas where the EMS services take longer to get to those remote areas. But we also have some free screenings available. We'll have hearing screenings, glaucoma, skin cancer, and some peripheral arterial disease screenings by Health Gauge, who's one of our benefit partners and also does that screening out in the rural areas throughout the state.
So let's turn our attention, Evelyn, to the prizes that are at stake here. You're going to make it worth people's while to come out to Farm Bureau Park with a couple of different drawings, 3 different drawings.
Right. The first one, all fairgoers have a chance to take the Farm Bureau Member Benefits Challenge, and that's for a chance to win $500 in free groceries. And it is easy because we do have all the answers posted in the tent, so it's an open book quiz and really opens fairgoers' eyes to the benefits of being a Farm Bureau member. Now, in addition to that, current members have a chance to win $5,000 in a food and fuel package. That's $2,500 in food and $2,500 in fuel. Members can also then pick up their free member gift for stopping to visit us. What they should also do is bring a friend, family member, or neighbor who's not a member, because there is absolutely no better time to join the Iowa Farm Bureau than during the state fair. Those new members are also put in a special drawing, and that is for a chance to win a $1,000 food and fuel package.
So in addition to what's going on every day of the fair out at Farm Bureau Park, I know that we have some special days. We've got Young Farmer Day, we've got Farm Bureau Day at the fair, the Century and Heritage Farm Awards. Talk us through those special days and what people can expect out at the fair those days.
Yes, we're excited because the young farmers take over Farm Bureau Park on the first Saturday of the fair. The young farmers bring in extra games and activities for young children to draw them in. Free games and a chance to get a little card stamped so that if they visit all the activity centers, from kicking a ball through a barn door to learning how soybean and corn seeds germinate and grow, they'll have a chance to win a backpack to hold all the other items they pick up at the fair. It's also a great time to talk to young farmers about the challenges of getting into agriculture and what draws them into that profession. Then on Tuesday, August 15th, that's another big day at Farm Bureau Park. You just follow your nose. We sponsor a huge cookout contest that takes place on the Grand Concourse by Farm Bureau Park. And yes, there are free food samples, and one king will be crowned at 11 o'clock as the winner of all the categories of meat. There is one other event I want to highlight. It's not at Farm Bureau Park, it's at the Pioneer Hall, but Century and Heritage Farms are awarded to hundreds of families every year, and Farm Bureau is a partner with IDOLS in recognizing farms that have been held within the same family for at least 100 years for Century Farm recognition, or 150 years for Heritage Farm recognition. And just this year alone, there are 242 farms that have reached the Century Award designation and 156 more that have reached the Heritage Farm Award level.
We'd love to see that, love to recognize those farm families. It's really pulling back into that theme of, generations of conservation. it's so great to see those families out there and to know that a lot of that is being sustained by what is being done on the land, the practices, the pride that's taken, the care that's been given throughout generations. So that's always a highlight as well. Like you said, the Century and Heritage Farm Awards. A whole lot going on in the park and beyond throughout the state fair. Where can people go to learn a little bit more if they want to come out?
They can visit iowafarmbureau.com/state fair online to see what's happening every day at the fair. And be sure and stop to see us, where it will be on the east side of the Varied Industries building. We'll be wearing T-shirts that claim the national champions, Iowa farmers as national champions in conservation. So look for our championship T-shirts and you'll find Farm Bureau Park.
There's nothing quite like the Iowa State Fair, and we hope to see you out there. If you'd like to read up on all of the fair details that Evelyn just shared and more, we've given you the link to check out those details in the notes for this podcast episode. Also down in the notes are links to 5 educational events that Iowa Farm Bureau is offering rural entrepreneurs and farmers over the next few weeks. The first 3 events you'll see are Renew Rural Iowa Journey to Your Vision seminars. We have 3 Journey to Your Vision seminars coming up. We have seminars in Waverly and West Des Moines in August, and in October we have one in Storm Lake. These half-day seminars are really catered to rural entrepreneurs who are looking to evaluate their existing businesses and take them to the next level. It's a great program, and the cost is being underwritten by Farm Bureau and ISU's Center for Industrial Research and Service, so be sure to check those out and pass them along if you know an entrepreneur who could benefit from that experience. The 4th event link down in the podcast notes is an online version of our popular Take Root Farm Secession workshops. Those online workshops start in mid-August, so be sure to check that out and get registered if your family is looking for help developing an effective farm secession plan. And the final event we've listed is a webinar in late August. That one's going to offer tips for navigating the current economic forces facing agriculture. Again, all of those links are down in the notes for this podcast episode, and of course, you can also find them just by visiting iowafarmbureau.com. That's all for this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you found it useful and that you'll join us for the next episode on August 14th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to The Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.